times, the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure. It's one of the characteristics that makes the Bible stand out above every other book. Certainly every claimed revelation of God around different religions of the world, etc., the Bible stands absolutely unique because of many reasons, but one of the principal reasons, and the one that we're looking at this afternoon, is the fact that God actually declares what is going to take place in the future. And that brings out one aspect about the nature of God that makes him unique from anyone or anything else, and that is his foreknowledge. He knows everything. It's hard for us to grasp that, but it's just reality and it's a fact. And we can look back through the pages of history and we can see the verification that things that were written aforetime, which the Bible says are written for our learning so that we might have comfort and hope through these things that verify the truth of God and give us great strength in so doing. We can look back on those and confirm that when God says something, it is done. It just reminds me of the situation. We talk about healings and needs, etc., and these things are always cropping up in their lives, in the lives of the saints. And there was a situation where Jesus was approached by the centurion. You may recall the account in the Gospels, and the centurion told Jesus about his servant was sick on the point of death, etc. And Jesus said, great, I'll come to your house and heal this man. And the centurion turned around and said, just say the word and it's done. And that was a demonstration of having belief and trust in the God that knows the end from the beginning. We're in safe hands, brothers and sisters. That's what we had in the message this afternoon in the first meeting, and we're only confirming that again through another different aspect through Bible prophecy. That when God says something, it is so. There are no debates. They can argue about these things till they're blue in the face, but at the end of the day, God's word stands. And as we read here, he will do all his pleasure. At the end of the day, we are created for the pleasure of God. The whole duty of man is to serve God and keep his commandments. And if you want to have a successful life, if you want to know what the future really holds, then the key to this is to do what God said. Take the advice of Mary, the mother of Jesus, at the wedding feast at Cana. They didn't have any answers of what to do, and she turned around and says, whatever he says, do it. That's just as valid today in all people say. Okay. So, how important is Bible prophecy to us? Sometimes we might shun Bible prophecy. It's difficult, it's complicated. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's extremely important. We read in 2 Peter 1 verse 19, we have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto you do well, you take heed as unto a light that shineth in a dark place until the day dawn and the day start arise in your hearts. This is important because, you know, as the dawn approaches, there's the promise of a glimmer of light. When the light approaches, then we can start to see the details of the landscape of what's going on around us. Bible prophecy is a guidepost in this life. You know, when you look in the media today, there are so many things happening, it leaves your head in a spin. You know, there's the situation with Russia at the moment, there's the Middle East, it's always a powder keg of trouble. There's all sorts of distresses and social problems right on our doorstep. The Bible talks about the signs of the times. What do we do about it? How do we have confidence for our own future? How do we know how our life should be directed? Bible prophecy is one of the guideposts that the Lord gives us so that he doesn't keep us in the dark. He sheds light through his word on what is going on. And we'll be talking about that as we go through in this presentation. Now, having said that it's a light in a dark place, we have to realize there are limitations in this. It says in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 9, Well, 1 Corinthians 13 and 12, now we see through a glass darkly, and then in 1 Corinthians 13 verse 9, we know in part and we prophesy in part. Now this is a bit of a disclaimer really, because we don't know every detail about prophecy. We know bits and pieces. It's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. It's a picture that you're putting together, and as more details are filled in, you see the overall scheme of things. And as time is progressing on, in a historical fashion, we can look back and see what God originally declared, how it's been fulfilled through the pages of history. And if we follow that pattern and reasoning all the way through, it builds our confidence that God does actually know what he's doing. And nothing is haphazard. This is not an evolutionary process. It's not subject 100% to chance and circumstance. God actually knows the outcome. Now, when we're talking about this, we're not talking about trivia. We're not talking about things like horoscopes, where it's day-to-day trivia that are speculated on. We're talking about fundamental things that are happening on this planet. Fundamental things that are going to affect our future into the eternity, where you're going to be spending your time. The Bible tells us that if we put our sights on the Word of God, if we found ourselves on the rock, then we will spend eternity in the kingdom of God. There's the other end of the scale. If we choose to refuse these things or we ignore them, then we do so at our own peril. So right up front, I want to make a disclaimer, because we're going to be discussing a few things about the patterns of history and about certain dates and developments that have gone on through the years and how it could progress on to what's going to happen in the future. I'm sure there are many people now, including us sitting, or standing in this room, who'd like to know what's going to happen in the immediate future. It's of great interest to us. And the Bible actually gives us the answers. The Bible gives us the answers to the fundamental things that are important, what we need to know. And every piece of advice and guidance that's necessary to see people into the kingdom of God is all in the Bible. But we're going to be mentioning dates and things, and I don't want anyone to go away and say, oh, it's really cracked up now, he's given dates for the coming of the Lord. And look, I know exactly when the Lord's going to come, and so do you, when you least expect it. That's when the Lord's going to come back. When the world are unsuspecting, that's when the Lord is going to return. We don't know the day and we don't know the hour. However, in 1 Thessalonians it says that we're not ignorant of the times and the seasons. We're not completely up to speed with all the fine details, and there's the Lord deliberately makes it that way, but we do know the general landscape. We have a good general outlook, and we know that we are in the last days. In fact, according to the Bible, we've been in the last days since the day of Pentecost. Because Peter got up and quoted from the book of Joel, saying that in the last days, God would pour out his Spirit. And we are living evidence that that's true today, because God's poured out his Spirit on the majority of people in this room right now. So we're in the last days as far as God's program is concerned, but the Bible also emphasizes, if you like, something we could describe as the last days of the last days. We're right up at the end of God's program for this gospel age, and we're heading very fast for a big conclusion. We know in part, we prophesy in part. I want to consider some following years here, some dates, because they're very significant. 1517, 1917, 1967, 2017, which we're almost on the threshold of now. Now, something you would have noticed that they all have a bit of a pattern associated with them. We'll look into these dates as we go through, and we'll just mention a few things about them. But the question is, and the question that's really in everyone's mind, we're only about 2 weeks or so away from a new year, moving into 2017. Now, who knows, you know, the Lord knows, we may not actually get there, but let's just say that we do. What is going to happen in 2017? What kind of events might take place? What kind of developments are going to take place in the world? Well, 2016 is a very good indication of how that's going to go. Because really 2016 in a prophetic sense has been very much a preparatory year. A lot of things are happening all across the world. We'll look at them as we go through. Now, when we look at historical patterns, it's a little bit like this diagram here. You know, you've got the past, and you've got the future, and that's based on what we can see in the present. And you know, when you match up what's going on, what has happened in the past, and we can see what's in the present, it gives us a pretty good indication of where we're going in the future. Now, if we can fit the Word of God into that, it's extremely important, because you see, God is a God of order. The Bible is full of patterns. There's nothing that's done indiscriminately or just haphazardly. And we're going to be looking into one aspect that God set up as far as chronology is concerned, and that's the years of Jubilee. As we'll find out in Leviticus 25, it talks about every 50th year, there is a special year that God sets aside for the people of Israel in particular. It's called a Jubilee year, Shemitah. And in the Hebrew, it's a year of release. It's a year where incredible things are going to happen. Now, let's start with the first of those 4 dates in 1517. We're only looking at this stage on what happened in Europe and what happened with Jerusalem. And the reason we're looking at Jerusalem is that the Bible puts a great emphasis on Jerusalem right from the days of King David right through to the consummation when Jesus Christ will return. We all know, if we have any understanding about Bible prophecy, that Jerusalem will be encompassed by armies. It will become a cup of trembling unto every nation, according to the book of Zechariah. We're living in the era where that is coming to an absolute head. Jerusalem will be attacked. That's what the Bible tells us. There'll be a confederation of armies that will come down, led up by a nation called Gog from the land of Magog. We've looked into these many times before. We might just touch on them as we go through. So we're going to look at the history of Europe in 1517 and the history of Jerusalem. There are some amazing events taking place. On the 31st of October, 1517, the Reformation started, really, the Protestant Reformation. That was the exposure of the papal system. What we have to realize that for 1260 years, the Roman Catholic Church, headed up by the Pope, that's known as the papacy, that system ruled the European continent with a rod of iron. They had the power of life and death. You couldn't buy or sell without their authority. They ruled everyone ecclesiastically and politically and militarily for that entire period of time. Now, by the time we come to the beginning of the 16th century, a Roman Catholic and Augustinian monk called Martin Luther, the German, he discovered, through looking at the scriptures, it's a long story, in 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Turks, all these scholars with the manuscripts in the original Greek language moved westward. And the Bible, as we know it now, translated from the original languages, which prior it had been only known in Latin. They were opened up to the learned people, and the only learned people then were people like Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk. Anyway, cutting a long story short, he began to understand the scriptures, and he was horrified because all of the details and descriptions he found about Babylon the Great and Antichrist actually matched 100% with the Roman Catholic system. And it took great courage, because his life was at stake. He went to the castle church at Wittenberg in Germany, and he nailed his 95-point thesis to the door, nominating all the errors of the Catholic Church and exposing them. And that caused an absolute political and religious earthquake right across the European continent. And that became the start of what was known as Protestantism, from the word protesting against the authority of the papacy. A monumental event that took place in Europe. The papal reaction was almost immediate. They convened plans to incorporate what they called the Counter-Reformation. And it wasn't until later years that they, at the Council of Trent, they set up the Society of Jesus, which is otherwise known as the Jesuits. And they're the stormtroopers of the Catholic Church. I've got no other way of describing them. You could give 3 talks on that alone, some of the horrific things they've been involved in. And when it talks about the revival of spirituality, it's got nothing to do with the Holy Spirit. That's just a code word for reimposing the supremacy of the Catholic Church and bringing these protesting people back under the papal fold. And there's been a war going on ever since, thousands of years. People think today that the Catholic Church are a spent force. Forget it. They're not a spent force. They are still extremely powerful. Do you know there's only one religious organization on this planet that's got a seat on the United Nations and the European Parliament? And that's the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican. They created their own state, the Vatican, and they actually operate as a separate country. And they have massive influence. And their main influence is through what they call the Christian Democrat parties in Europe today. And it's all tied in with the European community, of which, as we know, in recent years, incredible things are happening there. We'll say more of that as we go on. Now we flick over to Jerusalem. In the same year, 1517, incredible things were happening in Jerusalem. Now the first thing is, these years, as I mentioned before about the Jubilee, this was a Jubilee year. And according to Leviticus 25, a Jubilee year is a release of land and there's a release of debts. And they blow a trumpet and proclaim liberty throughout the nation of Israel. Now, at this particular time, Jerusalem in 1517, up to a particular time, was under Mohammedan rule, under Islamic rule, under the Mamelukes, which were a dynasty of sultans. And we find that in that very year, the Ottoman Turks took over. They captured Jerusalem. The Mamluk Sultanate was defeated by Selim I, and it began 400 years of Ottoman rule. Now, these people were not completely released, but history shows us that the Ottomans were far more lenient than the Mamluks, and they allowed certain religious and political liberties that people never had before. So it wasn't a complete release from being under the yoke, but it was the promise of things improving, and it happened exactly on a year of Jubilee. And the Day of Atonement, actually, Yom Kippur, is the day that the Jubilees corresponding to that year are commemorated. If we go on, we fast forward 400 years now. We have to abbreviate things. Other things take place every 50 years, but these are the really significant ones. 1917 in Europe. The World War I had started. In 1914, it was at the situation that in the Western Front, that's in Western Europe, they were at a stalemate. Well over 1 million people had been slaughtered by this time, and the system of trenches and everything is well documented. That just shows a photograph of what a forest in Flanders looked like after the first onslaught of mechanized warfare. World War I was very, very significant. It's called World War I because it's the first war that's brought many nations into conflict with one another. And it also accelerated technology and weapons, literally of mass destruction at that time. Of course, we've learned to do that more efficiently as time has gone on, but certainly very significant. It was also in 1917 the Russian monarchy under Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown on March of that year. And the Bolshevik Revolution, which is the communist, the start of the Russian communism, was in November 1917. So absolutely crucial in world history for a number of reasons. One, the emergence of Russia. Now, prior to that time, they were under the Tsar, which, by the way, is the Russian word for Caesar, because the Russians believe that they are the third Rome. And Putin is actually saying that today. He's claiming czarship or Caesarship over the original Roman Empire, which did extend into Russian territory when it got to the height of its power. And then, you know, when the papacy took over, things changed a bit there. But very, very significant things happening. In Jerusalem, 1917, absolutely monumental year. Again, it's a jubilee. Remember, the jubilee signifies a time of release of debts, of returning the rightful owners of the land to their possession. And what happens in 1917? Jerusalem was liberated. Not only did it mark the end of 400 years of Ottoman rule, it actually marked what we know from the Bible in Leviticus 26, verse 18. It's called the times of the Gentiles, where from 604 BC through to 1917 is 2,520 years. You have to take into account going from BC to AD, you have to knock a year off, and that's how you come to that figure. Exactly as the Bible prophesied, I was going to say predicted, but stopped myself from saying that. Prophesied, declared that when the people of God disobeyed continually, God would pass 7 times of punishment over them. A time is 360 years. If you multiply it by 7, 2,520 years, and to this exact time, that's when Jerusalem was liberated. And that little photograph, believe it or not, is a photograph. It's very old. Shows General Allenby coming in through the Jaffa Gate, which means the Gate of Peace. And beforehand, actually, the Kaiser Wilhelm of the German Empire came through that very same gate, riding on a white horse as a conqueror. When Allenby came through that gate, he walked through. He got off of his horse and he walked through into the city. He proclaimed freedom for the nations and people that were already there. Not one shot was fired, which is another fulfillment of prophecy. And it was the first action in which the Royal Flying Corps, 14 Squadron, by the way, which is still operating to this day with modern aircraft. And in Isaiah 31, there's a prophecy that as birds flying, would God defend Jerusalem. And that's exactly what they've done. They flew over and they dropped leaflets encouraging the Turks to put their arms down and leave. Now, the Turks were known to be fierce fighters. The Ottoman Empire was very proud of their hundreds of years' heritage. And overnight, on the 9th of December 1917, they put down the weapons and withdrew without a shot being fired in the precincts of the city. And Allenby was able to walk down actually 2 days later on the 11th of December. Now, in the book of Haggai, chapter 2, it says that Jerusalem would have a special day of rejoicing, a day to be considered. It's mentioned 3 times in chapter 2, and it's the 24th of the 9th month. On the Jewish calendar, that's the 24th Kislev, which is the 9th month in the Hebrew calendar. And it just happened that in 1917, that came out as the 9th of December, the very day that the city was liberated. And just as a little ironic twist, the surrender was taken by 2 cooks on the road outside Jerusalem. the mayor of Jerusalem came out with the keys of the city and mistook these two cooks for the leading infantry. They were probably going to hit them in the head with a ladle or something, I don't know. And they handed over the keys of the city. And as they say, the rest is history. Again, this took place on a Jubilee year. The exact day is mentioned in the Bible absolutely clearly. We come forward another 50 years, so a single Jubilee forward from there, we come to the year 1967. By then, the USA is actually, I didn't mention it before, but 1917 was the year that the United States joined the First World War as well. A fulfillment of Bible prophecy that is that the older son of the Ephraim Manasseh twins, the older son was Manasseh, and although the younger son would become the greater, the elder son would take up his position in later life. It's actually been fulfilled there from 1917 forward. We see Britain's influence in the world diminishing and the US influence increasing to become the world's biggest democracy and most powerful, the superpower in the world. Of course, things are changing rapidly now. Russia had emerged through Russia, the Soviet Union, and I'll need to get my spelling checked out there, China as well. Now, we just look at Europe. In that very year, the first session of the European Community convened in Rome. That's interesting because it's based on a treaty called the Treaty of Rome that took place in the 1950s. But three different independent bodies or commissions in Europe got together and created what we know now as the European Union. Britain applied a second time to join this union. You may be aware of this. We believe from Bible prophecy that Britain has got a big identification with the Israel nation and the expansion of the Israel people. In the process of time, they would become a multitudinous nation, a great nation, and a company of nations. And we believe this is fulfilled in the United States of America as the great nation and the company of nations as the British Empire and Commonwealth. An empire that covered the entire globe, parts of the globe, such that the sun never set on it. And it's something like 30 or 40 times bigger than the Roman Empire at its height when we go back to the 19th century. Anyway, Britain applied the first time to join us and were rejected. We just don't learn the lesson, people. And they applied the second time during this year. That was the embryo of joining what is known as a common market. Also, in the same year, USA and Russia, or the USSR as it was known then, signed a nuclear non-proliferation space treaty. And we entered a period of peace talks. This was really the start of the peace talks in the sense of nuclear arms. And at the same time, China exploded its first thermonuclear weapon on the 17th of June that year. It set the mold for the next step in the development of how things are going to go. So it's very, very interesting. Now we flick over back to Jerusalem. What happened in this Jubilee year? Another Jubilee, but this is one after 1917, the Six-Day War. State of Israel, it was attacked by the United Arab Republic, headed up by Egypt, and they were completely destroyed. Just to give you an example, in less than 24 hours, the entire Egyptian Air Force was